The winter of 1887 brought an early and bitter cold to the hills surrounding Millbrook, Connecticut. By November, the temperatures had plunged so low that even the most experienced farmers spoke of omens and warned their neighbors to keep their children close. It was into this harsh landscape that Mother Superior Agnes Hartwell arrived with 23 children from St. Agnes Orphanage, claiming they were being relocated to a new facility better suited to their needs. What the people of Millbrook didn't know was that Mother Superior Hartwell was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Catherine Murdoch, and she had been dismissed from 3 previous religious institutions under circumstances that church authorities had worked desperately to keep hidden. The children in her care were not being relocated for their benefit, but for something far more sinister. The records of what happened during those final weeks of 1887 were sealed by federal authorities and remained classified until 1994, when a researcher conducting genealogical work for descendants accidentally uncovered a cache of documents that had been misfiled in the National Archives. What those documents revealed was a systematic pattern of abuse, exploitation, and ultimately murder that shocked even seasoned federal investigators. St. Agnes Orphanage had been established in 1874 in the small town of Riverside, Massachusetts, as part of the Catholic Church's expanding mission to care for the growing number of children left parentless by industrial accidents, disease, and the ongoing challenges of immigrant life in America. The facility was designed to house up to 30 children, providing them with basic education, religious instruction, and preparation for either adoption by Catholic families or apprenticeships that would allow them to support themselves as adults. The original Mother Superior, Sister Mary Catherine, had run the institution with genuine compassion and dedication. Under her care, St. Agnes had developed a reputation as one of the most successful orphanages in New England, with nearly 90% of its children successfully placed in loving homes or meaningful employment. Church inspectors consistently praised the facility's operation, and donations from wealthy Catholic families kept it well-funded and properly maintained. This success, however, would prove to be the institution's downfall. In 1883, Sister Mary Catherine contracted tuberculosis and died after a brief illness. The Diocese of Boston, unwilling to risk disrupting such a successful operation, moved quickly to find a replacement. They were approached by Catherine Murdoch, who presented herself as an experienced administrator with impeccable credentials from institutions in Ireland and New York. What church authorities failed to discover was that Catherine Murdoch's previous positions had ended under troubling circumstances. At St. Bridget's Home for Girls in County Cork, Ireland, she had been quietly dismissed after several residents complained of inappropriate punishments and unusual nighttime activities. Her subsequent position at Sacred Heart Children's Home in Albany, New York, had ended even more abruptly when local authorities began investigating the suspicious deaths of 3 children under her care. Murdoch had learned from these earlier experiences. She understood that the key to avoiding scrutiny was maintaining outward appearances while carefully selecting victims who would not be missed or whose disappearances could be easily explained. Orphaned children, particularly those without living relatives or connections to influential families, represented the perfect opportunity. When Catherine Murdoch assumed control of St. Agnes Orphanage In September 1883, she inherited 28 children ranging in age from 4 to 16. To outside observers, nothing appeared to change. The children continued to attend daily religious services, received their lessons, and maintained the gardens and workshops that provided both education and modest income for the institution. Church inspectors found no cause for concern during their quarterly visits. But within the walls of St. Agnes, a different reality was taking shape. These punishments, initially involving extended periods of prayer and fasting, gradually escalated to physical abuse disguised as religious penance. More disturbing was Murdoch's practice of selecting certain children for special religious instruction that took place in the basement of the main building during nighttime hours. Children chosen for these sessions often returned to their dormitories in states of obvious distress, but their attempts to describe what had occurred were dismissed by other staff members as nightmares or attempts to avoid religious obligations. The first disappearance occurred in March 1884 when 10-year-old Timothy Walsh, who had been at the orphanage for 2 years, simply vanished overnight. Mother Superior Murdoch announced to the other children that Timothy had been blessed with adoption by a wealthy family who preferred to keep their charitable works private. When the children asked why Timothy hadn't said goodbye, they were told that sudden departures were sometimes necessary to avoid emotional distress. Over the following months, 5 more children disappeared under similar circumstances. Each time, Murdoch provided plausible explanations. Some had been adopted, others had been transferred to specialized institutions better suited to their particular needs, and a few had supposedly been reunited with distant relatives who had been located through church networks. The remaining children grew increasingly fearful and withdrawn. The atmosphere within St. Agnes became one of constant terror, with children learning to avoid attracting attention that might lead to their selection for special instruction or mysterious relocation. By the summer of 1886, only 15 of the original 28 children remained at St. Agnes. New arrivals, typically younger children whose parents had died in industrial accidents or disease outbreaks, would stay for a few months before either disappearing or dying under circumstances that Murdoch attributed to pre-existing health conditions or tragic accidents. The pattern might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the intervention of Father Michael O'Brien, a young priest assigned to conduct routine inspections of diocesan institutions. Unlike his predecessors, who had been content with brief visits and superficial observations, Father O'Brien took his oversight responsibilities seriously and began asking detailed questions about the children's welfare and the institution's operations. During a visit in August 1886, Father O'Brien noticed several troubling signs. The children appeared malnourished and fearful, flinching when adults approached them. Several showed signs of recent injuries that Murdoch attributed to accidents during work assignments. Most concerning was the children's reluctance to speak about their daily activities or their missing friends. When Father O'Brien attempted to interview children privately, Murdoch insisted on being present, claiming that unsupervised contact with outsiders violated diocesan policy. The children's responses to his questions were stilted and obviously rehearsed, suggesting they had been coached on what to say. Father O'Brien's suspicions deepened when he examined the institution's records. The documentation for adopted children lacked the detailed paperwork typically required for such placements. Transfer records for children supposedly sent to other institutions contained irregularities and inconsistencies. Most disturbing, the death certificates for children who had allegedly died of natural causes showed patterns that seemed statistically improbable. When Father O'Brien raised these concerns with diocesan authorities, he was initially told that Mother Superior Murdoch's methods, while perhaps unconventional, had produced excellent results in terms of successful placements. Church officials were reluctant to interfere with an institution that appeared to be fulfilling its mission effectively while requiring minimal oversight or additional funding. But Father O'Brien persisted in his investigation. He began conducting surprise visits to St. Agnes, arriving at unusual hours and insisting on thorough inspections of all areas of the facility. During one such visit in October 1886, he discovered a locked room in the basement that Murdoch claimed was used for storage of religious artifacts too valuable to be left unsecured. When Father O'Brien demanded to see inside the room, Murdoch became agitated and claimed that the key had been misplaced. Her obvious distress and the children's terrified reactions to any mention of the basement convinced Father O'Brien that something was seriously wrong at St. Agnes Orphanage. Acting on his own authority, Father O'Brien contacted local law enforcement and requested a formal investigation of the institution. Sheriff William Hendricks, initially reluctant to interfere in church affairs, was persuaded by Father O'Brien's detailed documentation of irregularities and his obvious concern for the children's welfare. On November 15, 1886, Sheriff Hendricks arrived at St. Agnes with a search warrant and 2 deputies. What they discovered in the locked basement room would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The space had been converted into what could only be described as a torture chamber with restraints, implements designed to inflict pain, and evidence of prolonged suffering. More horrifying was the discovery of human remains hidden beneath the basement floor. Forensic examination would later confirm that at least 11 children had been murdered at St. Agnes, their bodies showing signs of systematic torture and abuse before death. Catherine Murdoch was arrested immediately, but her reign of terror was not yet over. As news of the investigation spread, she claimed that she had been acting under divine guidance and that the children's suffering had been necessary for their spiritual purification. More disturbing was her revelation that the remaining children at St. Agnes had been so thoroughly traumatized and indoctrinated that they would require extensive care to recover from their experiences. The scandal that erupted following these discoveries rocked the Catholic Church and led to nationwide reforms in the oversight of religious institutions. But for Catherine Murdoch, justice would prove elusive. While awaiting trial, she convinced authorities that the children would be better served by relocation to a facility with specialized resources for treating traumatized youth. It was this decision that led to the events of November 1887, when Murdoch, using forged credentials and claiming to be Mother Superior Agnes Hartwell, departed St. Agnes with 23 children supposedly bound for a progressive treatment facility in Connecticut. What actually happened during that journey and the ultimate fate of those 23 children would remain a mystery for over a century. The investigation into Murdoch's escape revealed a level of planning and preparation that suggested she had anticipated exposure and prepared for flight. Financial records showed that substantial sums had been transferred from church accounts to private banks under assumed names. Correspondence discovered in her personal quarters indicated connections to individuals in other states who were prepared to assist her in establishing new operations under different identities. Most chilling was a journal found hidden in her room that contained detailed plans for expanding her activities beyond single institutions. Murdoch had envisioned a network of facilities across the country where vulnerable children could be subjected to what she termed purification processes without interference from authorities or concerned family members. The 23 children who disappeared with Murdoch represented more than just victims of her immediate crimes. They were potential witnesses to years of abuse, murder, and systematic exploitation. Their silence was essential to her continued freedom, and the methods she had used to ensure that silence in the past suggested that their fate was already sealed when they left St. Agnes for the final time. Federal investigators who later examined the case concluded that Murdoch's operation at St. Agnes had been merely the most visible portion of a larger criminal enterprise. Evidence suggested similar activities at multiple locations, coordinated through a network of corrupt officials and complicit staff members who shared both her twisted philosophy and her profitable exploitation of vulnerable children. The search for Catherine Murdoch and the missing children extended across multiple states and continued for several years. Reported sightings placed her in locations ranging from the mountains of Vermont to the industrial cities of Pennsylvania, always in connection with religious or charitable institutions that catered to parentless children. The closest authorities came to apprehending her occurred in the spring of 1888, when local police in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, raided a boarding house following reports of disturbing sounds and unusual activities. They found evidence of recent occupancy by a woman matching Murdoch's description, along with signs that multiple children had been held in the building's basement rooms. But once again, Murdoch had vanished before law enforcement arrived. A pattern emerged of her staying one step ahead of investigators, apparently warned by accomplices within the very institutions meant to apprehend her. The scope of her support network suggested corruption that extended far beyond individual facilities to include elements within law enforcement, church hierarchy, and local government. As 1888 became 1889, the active search for Catherine Murdoch gradually diminished. Resources were redirected to other cases, public attention moved to new scandals, and the bureaucratic machinery that had initially mobilized to find her began to focus on other priorities. The 23 children who had vanished with her became statistics in files that were eventually sealed and forgotten. But the story of Catherine Murdoch and the children of St. Agnes was far from over. In the decades that followed, scattered reports would surface of religious institutions where children disappeared under mysterious circumstances, where disciplinary practices crossed the line into torture, and where charismatic leaders claimed divine authority for unconscionable acts. Each incident bore hallmarks of Murdoch's methods, suggesting either her continued activities or the influence of others who had learned from her example. The network she had envisioned appeared to have taken root, growing in the shadows of America's expanding system of charitable institutions and religious organizations. The true extent of this network and the ultimate fate of the 23 children who vanished in that Connecticut winter of 1887 would remain hidden until a chance discovery in 1952 opened a new chapter in one of America's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. What investigators found buried in a remote section of the Millbrook Hills would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted families and law enforcement for over 6 decades. The morning fog hung heavy over Lake Superior as Father Patrick O'Brien's carriage rolled through the gates of what had once been St. Agnes Orphanage. 3 months had passed since Mother Superior Catherine Murdoch's dramatic escape with 23 children, vanishing into the vast American frontier like smoke dissipating in the wind. The trail had gone cold, but the priest's determination burned hotter than ever. What Father O'Brien discovered in those frigid December days of 1887 would shake his faith to its very foundations. The investigation that followed Mother Catherine's flight revealed a network of corruption and complicity that stretched far beyond the walls of a single Massachusetts orphanage. This was not the work of one deranged woman acting alone, but rather the visible tip of an iceberg of institutional evil that had been growing in the shadows of American society for decades. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a seamstress in nearby Springfield, approached Father O'Brien with a story that made his blood run cold. Her sister Margaret had worked as a cook at St. Agnes for nearly 2 years before disappearing in the spring of 1886. Mother Catherine had claimed that Margaret had returned to Ireland to care for an ailing mother, but Mrs. Hartwell knew this to be impossible. Their mother had been dead for over a decade. "I received letters, supposedly from Margaret," Mrs. Hartwell explained, her weathered hands trembling as she produced a small bundle of correspondence. "But the handwriting was wrong, Father. Margaret could barely write her own name, yet these letters were penned in perfect script." Father O'Brien examined the letters with growing unease. The handwriting was indeed too refined for an illiterate Irish immigrant, and the language was formal, almost clerical in its precision. More disturbing still were the subtle theological references woven throughout the correspondence, suggesting the author possessed considerable religious education. These were not the words of a homesick servant girl, but rather the calculated deceptions of someone well versed in manipulating human emotions. The priest's investigation into Margaret Hartwell's disappearance led him to a startling discovery. Church employment records showed that at least 17 staff members had left St. Agnes under similar circumstances over the past 5 years. Kitchen maids, groundskeepers, laundresses, and handymen had all supposedly returned to their homelands or found better positions elsewhere. Yet when Father O'Brien attempted to trace their destinations, he found only false addresses and fabricated references. Even more disturbing was the pattern he began to detect among the missing employees. All were immigrants with few local connections. All were described by surviving staff as having been particularly observant of Mother Catherine's methods, and all had disappeared shortly after witnessing incidents that in hindsight should have raised immediate alarm. Margaret Hartwell had vanished just days after questioning why certain children seemed unusually subdued after private meetings with Mother Catherine. A groundskeeper named Sean Murphy had disappeared within a week of discovering what appeared to be freshly disturbed earth in the orphanage garden. A young housemaid had gone missing after reporting strange sounds from the basement during late-night hours. The scope of Mother Catherine's operation became clearer as Father O'Brien delved deeper into the orphanage's financial records. What he discovered was a sophisticated system of fraud that had been generating substantial income for years. Fictional adoptions created paper trails for children who had actually been sold into various forms of servitude. Donations from well-meaning benefactors were systematically diverted to private accounts. Most disturbing of all were the payments recorded for what the ledgers cryptically referred to as special placements, sums far larger than typical adoption fees and corresponding to the disappearances of the most attractive children in Mother Catherine's care. But the financial crimes, horrific as they were, paled in comparison to what Father O'Brien uncovered next. Hidden within the orphanage's correspondence files was a cache of letters that revealed Mother Catherine's connections to a network of similar institutions across New England and beyond. The letters, written in the same precise hand as the fake correspondence from Margaret Hartwell, detailed a system of communication between corrupt religious authorities who shared information about profitable opportunities and potential threats to their operations. One letter, dated just 2 months before the priest's initial discovery of the torture chamber, was particularly chilling. Written to someone identified only as Brother Thomas at an institution in Vermont, it read, "The Irish priest grows troublesome. His visits have become more frequent and his questions more pointed. We may need to implement the Dublin solution sooner than anticipated. The cargo manifest for December includes 23 packages, as discussed." The reference to a Dublin solution sent Father O'Brien searching through older correspondence, where he found references to similar problems that had been resolved in Ireland. The letters suggested that Mother Catherine and her associates had faced exposure before and had dealt with troublesome investigators through methods that resulted in their permanent silence. The priest realized with growing horror that his own life had been in danger from the moment he first questioned Mother Catherine's methods. More disturbing still was the realization that Mother Catherine's network extended into the highest levels of church hierarchy. Several letters bore the seals of bishops and monsignors, men whose positions should have made them protectors of the innocent rather than enablers of abuse. These correspondence revealed a web of complicity that reached from remote orphanages to cathedral offices, bound together by shared profits and mutual blackmail. As winter deepened, Father O'Brien's investigation attracted the attention of federal authorities who had been tracking similar cases across multiple states. Agent Samuel Morrison of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation arrived in Massachusetts with files documenting a pattern of missing children and corrupt religious institutions that stretched from Maine to California. What they had initially believed to be isolated incidents were now revealed as components of a vast criminal enterprise that had been operating under the protection of religious authority for decades. The scope of the conspiracy became clear through testimony from other survivors who emerged as news of the St. Agnes investigation spread. Sister Mary Kathleen from a convent in Rhode Island came forward with accounts of children being transferred between institutions under mysterious circumstances. A former priest from New Hampshire described being pressured to falsify records and threatened with excommunication when he refused to cooperate. A government inspector from Connecticut reported discovering similar torture chambers in 3 separate religious facilities, only to have his reports buried by superiors who claimed such investigations would damage public faith in religious institutions. Most shocking of all was the testimony of Dr. William Crawford, a physician who had treated children from various Catholic institutions throughout New England. His medical records documented a pattern of injuries consistent with systematic abuse, but his reports to church authorities had been ignored or suppressed. Dr. Crawford revealed that he had been approached by representatives of Mother Catherine's network and offered substantial payments to falsify medical reports and death certificates. When he refused, he began receiving threats against his family that forced him to relocate his practice twice. The network's methods were as sophisticated as they were brutal. Children were moved between institutions using forged documents and false identities, making it nearly impossible for authorities to track their movements. Those selected for special placements were often drugged to ensure compliance during transport, and their destination records were deliberately obscured through multiple intermediaries. The most valuable children, those deemed attractive enough for the most lucrative placements, were often held in secure facilities for weeks or months while buyers were located and negotiations completed. Agent Morrison's investigation revealed that the network had established what amounted to a catalog system for their human merchandise. Detailed photographs and descriptions of available children were circulated among wealthy clients who could afford to pay premium prices for specific characteristics. The correspondence seized from St. Agnes included order forms that read like livestock auctions, with buyers specifying preferences for age, appearance, and temperament with chilling clinical detachment. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Mother Catherine's network had generated over $2 million in illegal profits over the past decade, equivalent to tens of millions in today's currency. This wealth had been used not only to enrich the conspirators, but to corrupt officials at every level of government and religious hierarchy. Judges had been bought, police investigations had been quashed, and even federal inspectors had been compromised through a combination of bribery and blackmail. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the discovery that the network had been conducting what could only be described as systematic experimentation on children in their care. Medical records found in the St. Agnes basement detailed procedures that had no legitimate therapeutic purpose, suggesting that some children had been used as test subjects for various drugs and treatments. The records indicated that these experiments had been conducted in collaboration with certain medical schools and pharmaceutical companies, creating a three-way partnership between corrupt religious authorities, unethical researchers, and profit-driven businesses. Dr. Morrison's analysis of these medical records revealed experiments designed to test pain tolerance, drug reactions, and psychological conditioning techniques. Children had been subjected to various forms of deprivation and stimulation while their responses were carefully documented. Most horrifically, some experiments appeared designed to determine the most effective methods of breaking a child's will and ensuring compliance with adult demands. The clinical language used in these reports could not disguise the fact that they documented systematic torture disguised as medical research. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the network had been selling detailed information about their experimental results to interested parties. Correspondence with certain military officials suggested that some findings had been deemed relevant to interrogation techniques and prisoner control methods. Letters with medical schools indicated that some research had been incorporated into studies of human psychology and behavioral modification. The children of St. Agnes and similar institutions had not only been victims of abuse and trafficking, but unwilling subjects in research that would inform future methods of human exploitation. As 1888 dawned, the full scope of Mother Catherine's crimes became clear. This was not merely a case of institutional abuse, but rather evidence of a criminal organization that had infiltrated religious institutions across America for the purpose of systematic exploitation. The network had created a pipeline that took vulnerable children from legitimate orphanages and fed them into a system of abuse, experimentation, and human trafficking that generated enormous profits while destroying countless young lives. The 23 children who had disappeared with Mother Catherine represented only the most recent victims of an enterprise that had been claiming lives for years. Federal investigators estimated that over the past decade, more than 300 children had vanished into the network's system, with fewer than 50 ever being recovered alive. The remainder had either died from abuse and experimentation, been sold into forms of servitude from which they never escaped, or simply disappeared without a trace into the vast criminal underworld that the network supplied. But even as the investigation revealed the horrific scope of Mother Catherine's crimes, the woman herself remained beyond reach. Reports placed her and her charges everywhere, from the Canadian wilderness to the Mexican border. But every leg proved false. She had vanished with the efficiency of someone who had planned for such an eventuality, leaving behind only the evidence of her crimes and the shattered lives of her victims. The trail had gone cold, but Father O'Brien knew that somewhere in the vast American frontier, Mother Catherine Murdoch was continuing her work. The network she had helped build was too profitable and too well established to simply collapse with her disappearance. Other institutions were still operating, other children were still disappearing, and other corrupt officials were still profiting from human misery disguised as Christian charity. The investigation had revealed the true face of evil, not the dramatic corruption of obvious villains, but the quiet complicity of respected authorities who had chosen profit over protection, institutional reputation over individual lives, and personal advancement over moral duty. This was the most insidious form of corruption because it hid behind the very symbols and institutions that society trusted most deeply. As Father O'Brien prepared his final report on the St. Agnes investigation, he reflected on the broader implications of what they had uncovered. This was not merely a criminal case, but a fundamental challenge to the moral foundations of American society. If religious institutions could be so thoroughly corrupted, if government officials could be so easily bought, and if respected professionals could participate in such systematic evil, then what protection did the innocent truly have? The priest's investigation had begun with the disappearance of 23 children from a single orphanage. It had revealed a criminal network that spanned the continent and reached into the highest levels of American society. But most importantly, it had demonstrated that evil often wears the most respectable faces and hides behind the most sacred symbols. The true horror of Mother Catherine Murdoch was not just what she had done, but how easily she had been able to do it under the protection of institutions that society trusted to guard its most vulnerable members. The children of St. Agnes deserved justice, but they also deserved to be remembered as more than mere victims. They were proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could endure. Their suffering had exposed a system of evil that might otherwise have continued operating in shadow. Their memory demanded that such institutions never again be allowed to hide their crimes behind the facade of religious authority. Father O'Brien closed his report with a prayer that the 23 missing children would somehow find safety and that their disappearance would serve as a warning to future generations about the price of unquestioned trust in authority. The morning of March 23, 1858, dawned cold and gray over the Massachusetts countryside, with patches of late winter snow still clinging to the bare branches outside St. Agnes Orphanage. Inside the limestone building, the surviving children huddled together in the common room, their small faces pale with a terror that had become their constant companion. They had learned to speak only in whispers, to move like shadows through the corridors, and to pray silently that they would not be chosen for Mother Superior Catherine's special blessings. What none of them knew was that their nightmare was about to take a turn towards something far worse than anything they had yet experienced. The events that would unfold over the following weeks would reveal that the horrors they had witnessed were merely the foundation for an operation so vast and so systematically evil that it would challenge the very understanding of what human beings were capable of when cloaked in religious authority. The transformation of St. Agnes from a place of supposed sanctuary into something resembling a factory of human misery had been gradual but relentless. In the 6 months since Mother Catherine had begun her most intensive phase of operations, the orphanage had processed more than 40 children through what she euphemistically called transitions. Some had been sold to wealthy families who paid premium prices for children who came with forged documentation and carefully constructed histories. Others had been transported to establishments in Boston, New York, and as far south as Charleston, where their youth and innocence commanded extraordinary sums from clients with particular predilections. The most disturbing aspect of Mother Catherine's enterprise was not the trafficking itself, though that was horrific enough, but the systematic way she had industrialized the corruption of innocence. She had created detailed protocols for breaking the spirits of new arrivals, carefully documented procedures for preparing children for their eventual destinations, and maintained meticulous records of which clients preferred which specific characteristics in their acquisitions. Her operation had evolved from opportunistic crime into something approaching scientific methodology in its precision and scope. Sister Margaret Walsh, who had initially been horrified by Mother Catherine's methods, had become her most efficient lieutenant in this enterprise. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable in maintaining the health of the children during their preparation periods, and her understanding of pharmaceutical compounds allowed her to keep the more resistant children in states of compliant docility. She had developed a series of drug regimens that could render children cooperative without leaving obvious traces of medication, making them appear naturally submissive to potential buyers. The financial records hidden in Mother Catherine's private quarters revealed the staggering profitability of their operation. In the previous year alone, they had generated more than $12,000 in revenue, an astronomical sum equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's currency. This money came from multiple sources: the sale of children to private buyers, regular payments from brothels and other establishments that specialized in young victims, and substantial fees from wealthy individuals who paid for temporary access to children who would later be disposed of to eliminate witnesses. But the money was not the primary motivation for Mother Catherine's increasingly elaborate schemes. Letters discovered in her personal correspondence revealed a woman driven by something far more disturbing than simple greed. She wrote extensively about her theories regarding the natural hierarchy of human beings, her belief that certain children were destined to serve the pleasures of their superiors, and her conviction that she was performing a kind of divine selection process that elevated worthy children to their proper roles in society. The true scope of her delusions became clear through a journal she maintained that detailed her observations of how different children responded to various forms of conditioning. She wrote with clinical detachment about which techniques were most effective in breaking down resistance, which children adapted most quickly to their new circumstances, and which methods of punishment produced the most lasting behavioral changes. Her entries read like the work of a researcher conducting systematic experiments on human subjects, with children serving as laboratory specimens in her twisted investigations. During the early months of 1858, Mother Catherine had begun expanding her operations beyond the orphanage itself. She established relationships with similar institutions in neighboring states, creating a network for exchanging children and sharing information about techniques and potential buyers. Correspondence with colleagues in Vermont, Connecticut, and New York revealed a community of individuals engaged in comparable enterprises, all of whom viewed their work as serving a higher purpose while generating substantial profits. The children who remained at St. Agnes during this period lived in a state of constant terror that was carefully calibrated to maintain their compliance. Mother Catherine had learned that children who were kept in a state of chronic fear were more manageable than those who were subjected to sudden, intense trauma. She created an environment where punishment was unpredictable but always severe, where any display of defiance or independence was met with consequences that served as examples to the other children. 10-year-old Thomas Brennan, who had been at the orphanage for nearly 2 years, had developed a nervous condition that caused him to stutter uncontrollably whenever adults addressed him directly. 12-year-old Mary O'Sullivan had stopped speaking entirely after witnessing the preparation of her friend Sarah for transfer to what Mother Catherine called a special placement. The younger children, some as young as 5, had learned to sit motionless for hours, their eyes vacant and their small hands folded in their laps, waiting for instructions that might mean the difference between another day of relative safety and selection for transition. The staff members who assisted Mother Catherine in her operations were bound to her through a combination of financial incentive, blackmail, and psychological manipulation. Sister Margaret had become so deeply implicated in the crimes that escape seemed impossible, but others were held through more subtle forms of control. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, who managed the orphanage's domestic operations, had initially been horrified by what she witnessed, but was gradually drawn into complicity through small compromises that accumulated into overwhelming guilt. Mother Catherine was particularly skilled at identifying the psychological vulnerabilities of her staff and exploiting them to ensure loyalty. She convinced Sister Margaret that their work was advancing medical knowledge about child development and psychology. She persuaded Mrs. Hartwell that the children who were sold to wealthy families were receiving opportunities for advancement that they would never have as orphans. She told the kitchen staff that the children who disappeared had been placed in apprenticeships where they would learn valuable trades. These justifications became increasingly elaborate as the operation expanded, creating a complex mythology that allowed staff members to participate in atrocities while maintaining their self-image as caregivers and protectors. Mother Catherine understood that most people could be convinced to participate in evil if it was presented gradually and accompanied by rationalizations that preserved their sense of moral righteousness. The external facade of St. Agnes remained carefully maintained throughout this period. Local officials who visited the orphanage saw well-dressed children engaged in appropriate activities, clean facilities, and staff members who spoke glowingly of their mission to provide care for disadvantaged youth. Mother Catherine was particularly skilled at managing these visits, ensuring that only the most compliant children were visible and that any signs of the institution's true nature were carefully concealed. The visiting committee from the state legislature that inspected St. Agnes in February 1858 was shown classrooms where children recited lessons in perfect unison, workshops where older children learned supposedly valuable skills, and dormitories that appeared to be models of institutional care. The committee members left with glowing reports about the orphanage's operations and recommended increased state funding for Mother Catherine's work. What the committee did not see were the basement rooms where children were held in isolation as punishment for minor infractions, the medical facility where Sister Margaret conducted her experiments with pharmaceutical compounds, or the detailed records that documented every aspect of the trafficking operation. They did not meet the children who had been selected for special attention and were being prepared for transfer to their ultimate destinations. The deception was so complete that several committee members made personal donations to support the orphanage's mission, believing they were contributing to a genuine charitable enterprise. Their endorsements were later used by Mother Catherine to solicit additional funding from wealthy donors who wanted to support what appeared to be an exemplary institution. But even as Mother Catherine's operation reached new heights of efficiency and profitability, the seeds of its destruction were already taking root. The disappearance of so many children, despite the careful documentation and plausible explanations, had begun to attract attention from sources that would prove far more difficult to deceive than visiting committees and local officials. The breakthrough that would ultimately expose the full scope of Mother Catherine's crimes came from an unexpected source. A former victim who had escaped from one of the establishments where St. Agnes children had been placed. Rebecca Morrison, now 15 years old, had been sold to a private household in Boston when she was 11, supposedly as a domestic servant, but actually to satisfy the deviant appetites of the family's patriarch. After nearly 4 years of abuse, Rebecca had managed to escape during a family trip to New York City. Rather than returning to Massachusetts, where she feared she would be recaptured, she had made her way to Philadelphia, where she sought refuge with a Catholic charity that assisted runaway children. The staff members at this facility were experienced in dealing with traumatized children and recognized that Rebecca's case was far more serious than typical runaway situations. Under careful questioning, Rebecca revealed details about St. Agnes Orphanage that immediately raised alarm bells. She described the systematic preparation of children for sale, the network of buyers who visited the orphanage to make selections, and the elaborate system of documentation that Mother Catherine used to track her inventory of children. Most importantly, she provided specific names and locations of other children from St. Agnes who had been placed in similar situations. The Philadelphia charity contacted federal authorities, who recognized that Rebecca's testimony described crimes that crossed state lines and involved what appeared to be a sophisticated trafficking network. The investigation that followed would reveal that Mother Catherine's operation was just one node in a larger enterprise that extended throughout the northeastern United States and involved hundreds of children over a period of nearly a decade. Federal investigators discovered that Mother Catherine had not been working alone or without precedent. Her methods and even her documentation systems were remarkably similar to those used by other individuals who had been operating comparable schemes in different states. The evidence suggested coordination and communication between these various operations, creating a network of child trafficking that was far more extensive than anyone had previously imagined. The investigation also revealed that Mother Catherine's background was not what she had claimed when she first arrived at St. Agnes. Her real name was Catherine Sullivan, and she had previously been involved in similar operations in Ireland before emigrating to America in the 1840s. She had used forged credentials and fabricated references to obtain her position at the orphanage, and her entire history as a religious sister was a carefully constructed deception. More disturbing was the discovery that several other individuals currently working in orphanages and religious institutions throughout New England had backgrounds similar to Mother Catherine's. The investigation suggested that there was a deliberate strategy of placing individuals with criminal histories in positions of authority over vulnerable children, creating a network of institutions that could be used for trafficking purposes while maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable work. As federal agents prepared to move against Mother Catherine and her associates, they faced the challenge of conducting their investigation without alerting their targets to the impending action. The scope of the operation and the number of children at risk meant that any premature disclosure could result in the destruction of evidence and the disappearance of both perpetrators and victims. The agents established surveillance of St. Agnes and several related locations, documenting the daily routines and identifying all individuals involved in the operation. They also worked to locate and interview other victims who had been placed through Mother Catherine's network building a comprehensive understanding of the crimes that had been committed and the locations where children might currently be held. The evidence they gathered painted a picture of systematic exploitation that was staggering in its scope and efficiency. Over the course of nearly 6 years, Mother Catherine's operation had processed more than 200 children, generating profits that exceeded $50,000 while destroying the lives of victims who had been scattered across multiple states and even shipped to buyers in other countries. The final phase of the investigation involved coordinating simultaneous raids on multiple locations to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key figures. Federal agents worked with local law enforcement in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut to execute search warrants and arrest warrants at precisely the same time, ensuring that Mother Catherine and her associates could not warn each other of the impending action. On the morning of March 23, 1858, as the surviving children at St. Agnes huddled together in their common room, federal agents were taking their final positions around the orphanage. The operation that would bring down one of the most sophisticated child trafficking networks in American history was about to begin, and the children who had suffered under Mother Catherine's regime were finally about to be rescued from their nightmare. But even as justice prepared to descend upon St. Agnes Orphanage, the full scope of the horrors that had been committed there remained hidden. The evidence that would be uncovered in the coming hours would reveal crimes so systematic and so extensive that they would challenge the nation's understanding of institutional corruption and the vulnerability of children to exploitation by those entrusted with their care. The raid that was about to commence would mark not just the end of Mother Catherine's reign of terror, but the beginning of a reckoning with the deeper systemic failures that had made such extensive abuse possible. The children of the darkness beneath St. Agnes Orphanage was about to reveal secrets that would shake the very foundations of American justice. By the winter of 1899, federal investigators had assembled enough evidence to understand that Mother Superior Catherine Murdoch's operation was merely one tentacle of a vast criminal enterprise that stretched across state lines and reached into the highest echelons of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas Whitmore, a telegraph operator at the Albany Western Union office, had been intercepting coded messages between various orphanages, medical facilities, and private residences for months. What began as casual curiosity about unusual transmission patterns evolved into a systematic documentation of what appeared to be a sophisticated communication network coordinating the movement of children across multiple states. Whitmore's records, meticulously maintained in a series of leather-bound ledgers, revealed a chilling pattern. Messages sent from St. Agnes to locations in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and as far west as Chicago contained coded references to packages, special deliveries, and premium merchandise. The timing of these communications aligned perfectly with the documented disappearances of children from the orphanage. More disturbing were the responses from receiving locations, confirmations of delivery, requests for specific characteristics in future shipments, and payments authorized for completed transactions painted a picture of children being treated as commodities in a grotesque marketplace. One message, decoded by federal cryptographers, read simply, "Boston client requests blonde female, age 8 to 10, musical ability preferred, payment of $2,000 authorized upon delivery. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities realized they were confronting not isolated incidents of abuse, but a coordinated trafficking network that had been operating for over a decade. Federal agents were dispatched to locations mentioned in the intercepted communications, uncovering a web of complicity that extended far beyond the walls of St. Agnes Orphanage. In Boston, investigators discovered that the prestigious Pemberton Academy for Young Ladies had been receiving children from St. Agnes under false pretenses. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the Academy's headmistress, maintained detailed records of each child's physical characteristics, temperament, and special abilities. These files, discovered hidden behind a false wall in her private office, contained photographs and intimate details that served as catalogs for potential buyers. Marginal notes in Dr. Thornfield's handwriting included prices, delivery dates, and customer preferences that revealed the commercial nature of the operation. The children who arrived at Pemberton Academy never attended actual classes. Instead, they were housed in a separate wing of the building, subjected to what Dr. Thornfield termed preparation training, and systematically prepared for transfer to private residences throughout New England. Those who proved difficult to manage or who attempted to escape were subjected to increasingly severe punishments designed to break their will and ensure compliance. Sarah McKenna, one of the few survivors later located by investigators, described her experience at Pemberton Academy in testimony that would become crucial to the prosecution's case. They told us we were being educated to become ladies, that wealthy families wanted to adopt us and give us better lives, she recalled, her voice barely above a whisper during her deposition. But there were no lessons, no books, only endless hours of what they called deportment training. Sarah's account revealed the systematic psychological conditioning employed to transform frightened children into compliant victims. The process began with isolation from other children, followed by the gradual erosion of individual identity through the removal of personal possessions, the assignment of new names, and the constant reinforcement that their previous lives had been erased. Children who resisted were punished through solitary confinement, reduced food rations, and physical abuse that left no visible marks. The preparation phase typically lasted 3 to 6 months, during which time potential buyers would visit the academy under the guise of philanthropic tours. These visits allowed patrons to observe the children in controlled environments, asking questions about their backgrounds, abilities, and temperaments, while academy staff provided detailed assessments of each child's suitability for specific purposes. Dr. Thornfield's records indicated that children were categorized into distinct groups based on their intended use. Those deemed suitable for domestic service were trained in household tasks and taught to be invisible and efficient. Children selected for what the records euphemistically termed private education were subjected to additional conditioning designed to ensure absolute obedience to authority figures. Most disturbing were the files on children designated for special arrangements, a category that investigators would later determine involved the most depraved forms of exploitation. The financial records seized from Pemberton Academy revealed the enormous profits generated by this trafficking operation. Between 1887 and 1899, the Academy had processed over 300 children from various sources, with St. Agnes Orphanage being their primary supplier. The average sale price per child ranged from $1,800 to $5,000, with premium rates charged for children with specific physical characteristics or special abilities. Musical talent, artistic skill, and unusual beauty commanded the highest prices in this human marketplace. Dr. Thornfield herself proved to be a fascinating study in the banality of evil. A well-educated woman from a respectable Boston family, she had initially entered the field of child welfare with apparently genuine intentions to help disadvantaged youth. Her transformation into a facilitator of child trafficking appeared to have been gradual, beginning with small compromises in ethical standards that eventually led to complete moral corruption. During her interrogation, Dr. Thornfield displayed a disturbing ability to rationalize her actions. She spoke of providing opportunities for children who would otherwise face lives of poverty and neglect, of connecting them with wealthy families who could give them advantages they would never have experienced in institutional care. When confronted with evidence of abuse and exploitation, she maintained that such incidents were aberrations rather than the intended purpose of her program. "I was saving these children from lives of destitution," she insisted during one particularly intense interrogation session. The families who received them were carefully selected individuals of means and education who could provide opportunities far beyond what any orphanage could offer. This ability to compartmentalize and rationalize heinous acts while maintaining a facade of respectability was a common trait among those involved in the trafficking network. Federal investigators noted repeatedly how individuals who appeared to be pillars of their communities had become complicit in systematic child abuse, often justifying their actions through elaborate self-deceptions about the benefits they were providing to their victims. The investigation in New York City revealed an even more disturbing dimension of the network. The Metropolitan Children's Placement Society, ostensibly a legitimate adoption agency serving wealthy families unable to have children of their own, had been functioning as a sophisticated distribution center for trafficked children from multiple sources, including St. Agnes Orphanage. Director Harrison Blackwood had established relationships with orphanages across the Northeast, offering substantial payments for children who met specific criteria requested by his clients. Unlike the crude selection processes employed at some facilities, the Metropolitan Society had developed a systematic approach to matching children with buyers based on detailed psychological profiles and physical assessments. The Society's offices occupied an elegant brownstone on Manhattan's Upper East Side, its respectable facade concealing operations that investigators would later describe as a human catalog service for the wealthy elite. Potential buyers were provided with detailed portfolios containing photographs, medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and recommendations for each available child. The level of documentation rivaled that of livestock breeding operations, reducing human beings to collections of desirable traits and marketable characteristics. Blackwood's client list, discovered in a hidden safe during the raid on his offices, read like a directory of New York's social elite. Banking magnates, railroad tycoons, prominent physicians, and even several clergymen had purchased children through his services. The prices paid ranged from $3,000 to $15,000 per child, with premium rates charged for what Blackwood termed exceptional specimens. The purposes for which these children were acquired varied widely, though all involved forms of exploitation that violated both legal standards and basic human decency. Some buyers sought domestic servants who could be controlled absolutely and paid nothing for their labor. Others wanted children for more disturbing purposes that court records would only hint at through euphemistic language designed to protect public sensibilities. Perhaps most chilling were the clients who purchased children for what they termed scientific purposes. Dr. Vincent Carruthers, a prominent neurologist affiliated with Columbia University, had acquired 7 children over a 5-year period for use in experimental research on pain responses and psychological conditioning. His private laboratory, discovered during a search of his Fifth Avenue mansion, contained equipment and documentation that revealed systematic experimentation on living subjects. Dr. Carruthers' research notes, written in clinical language that masked their horrific content, described procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance and the effectiveness of various psychological manipulation techniques. Children were subjected to controlled environments where their responses to different stimuli could be observed and documented. The supposed scientific purpose provided a veneer of respectability for activities that amounted to systematic torture. The doctor's justification for his research reflected the same moral blindness exhibited by other network participants. He spoke of advancing medical knowledge, of developing treatments for mental illness, and of contributing to humanity's understanding of the human mind. When confronted with the suffering he had caused, he expressed regret for the necessity of such methods, while maintaining that the potential benefits to society justified the means employed. Science requires sacrifice, Dr. Carruthers stated during his interrogation. Every medical advance has been built upon the suffering of those who came before. These children contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit countless others. This utilitarian rationalization of child abuse was particularly disturbing to investigators, who noted how educated individuals seemed capable of constructing elaborate intellectual frameworks to justify unconscionable behavior. The combination of scientific authority and social respectability had provided perfect cover for systematic cruelty that exceeded even the horrors uncovered at St. Agnes Orphanage itself. The Philadelphia component of the network operated through the Mercy House for Foundlings, another institution that masqueraded as a charitable organization while functioning as a processing center for trafficked children. Director Father Michael O'Reilly had established what he termed a private placement program that connected abandoned children with Catholic families seeking to expand their households through adoption. Father O'Reilly's operation was particularly insidious because it exploited religious faith to facilitate child trafficking. Potential buyers were presented as devout Catholic families who would provide children with moral education and spiritual guidance unavailable in institutional settings. The religious framework provided both cover for suspicious activities and psychological pressure on children to accept their situations as expressions of divine will. The priest maintained detailed records of placements that revealed the true nature of his operation. Children were matched with buyers based on specific requests for physical characteristics, ages, and temperaments. Payment arrangements were disguised as donations to the church, with amounts varying based on the perceived desirability of individual children. Premium prices were charged for children who possessed unusual beauty, musical ability, or other special talents. Father O'Reilly's religious authority provided him with unique access to vulnerable populations. He regularly visited other orphanages and charitable institutions throughout the region, identifying children who might be suitable for his placement program. His clerical collar and reputation for charitable work allowed him to remove children from institutions without arousing suspicion, often under the pretense of providing them with better opportunities elsewhere. The psychological manipulation employed by Father O'Reilly was particularly sophisticated, combining religious indoctrination with systematic conditioning designed to ensure compliance. Children in his care were taught that questioning authority was sinful, that suffering was a path to salvation, and that their placement with new families was part of God's plan for their lives. This religious framework made resistance both psychologically difficult and morally suspect in the minds of his victims. Mary Catherine Sullivan, who spent 6 months at Mercy House before being sold to a wealthy family in Pittsburgh, described the psychological atmosphere in testimony that revealed the priest's methods. Father O'Reilly told us that God had special plans for each of us, that we were chosen for purposes we couldn't understand, she recalled. He said that questioning these plans showed a lack of faith, that good children accepted whatever happened to them as expressions of divine love. The religious conditioning was reinforced through daily services, constant prayer, and regular confession sessions where children were encouraged to reveal their doubts and fears. Father O'Reilly used these intimate conversations to identify children who might pose problems and to refine his psychological manipulation techniques. Those who showed signs of resistance were subjected to additional religious instruction designed to break down their individual will and replace it with absolute submission to authority. The Chicago end of the network operated through multiple interconnected organizations that provided different services within the overall trafficking system. The Industrial School for Wayward Youth served as a collection point for runaway children and those removed from families by corrupt social services officials. The Progressive Child Development Institute conducted the psychological evaluations and conditioning that prepared children for placement. The Midwest Family Services Agency handled the actual sales and transfers to buyers throughout the region. This distributed approach made the Chicago operation particularly difficult to detect and investigate. Each organization maintained the appearance of legitimacy while serving specific functions within the broader criminal enterprise. The complexity of the system also provided multiple layers of deniability for participants who could claim ignorance of activities outside their immediate responsibilities. Director Jonathan Blackthorne of the Industrial School had developed particularly sophisticated methods for acquiring children without arousing official suspicion. He maintained relationships with corrupt police officers who would deliver runaway children to his facility rather than returning them to their families or placing them in legitimate institutions. Social services officials were paid to remove children from homes on fabricated charges of abuse or neglect, with the understanding that these children would be placed in Blackthorne's care. The school itself was designed to break down children's resistance through a combination of harsh discipline, inadequate nutrition, and systematic humiliation. New arrivals were subjected to what Blackthorne termed orientation procedures that included the confiscation of all personal possessions, assignment of institutional numbers instead of names, and confinement in isolation cells until they demonstrated appropriate submission to authority. Children who adapted quickly to institutional routines were rewarded with slightly better conditions and small privileges, creating a hierarchy that encouraged compliance and discouraged solidarity among inmates. Those who continued to resist were subjected to increasingly severe punishments, including prolonged solitary confinement, reduced food rations, and physical abuse that was carefully calculated to avoid permanent visible damage. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who operated the Progressive Child Development Institute, had developed what she termed scientific methods for evaluating and preparing children for placement in new environments. Her assessments included detailed psychological profiles, intelligence testing, and evaluations of each child's suitability for different types of work or service. This information was compiled into comprehensive reports that served as marketing materials for potential buyers. Dr. Morrison's conditioning programs were designed to modify children's behavior and psychological responses to meet the specific requirements of their intended placements. Children destined for domestic service were trained in appropriate subservience and invisibility. Those selected for more intimate exploitation were subjected to psychological conditioning designed to normalize inappropriate relationships with authority figures. The most troubling cases involved children being prepared for what the records termed experimental purposes, which involved conditioning designed to reduce their ability to resist or report abuse. The final component of the Chicago operation was managed by Robert Cunningham, whose Midwest Family Services Agency handled the logistics of matching children with buyers and managing the financial transactions involved in their sale. Cunningham had developed a sophisticated client management system that maintained detailed records of buyer preferences, purchase histories, and satisfaction levels with previous acquisitions. Cunningham's records revealed the scope and profitability of the entire network. Between 1890 and 1899, the Chicago operation alone had processed over 800 children, generating revenues exceeding $2 million. The average sale price per child had increased steadily over time, from approximately $100 to $200 in the early years to over $4,000 by the end of the decade, reflecting both inflation and the refinement of selection and conditioning processes. The geographic reach of the network extended far beyond the major urban centers initially investigated. Smaller operations in cities throughout the Midwest and Northeast served as feeder systems, collecting children from rural areas and small towns where disappearances were less likely to attract official attention. These satellite operations were typically managed by individuals with legitimate positions in social services, religious organizations, or educational institutions who used their professional authority to identify and acquire suitable children. The interconnected nature of the network was revealed through financial records that showed regular payments flowing between various organizations and individuals across multiple states. Mother Superior Catherine Murdoch had been both a supplier and coordinator within this system, using her position at St. Agnes Orphanage to identify children with characteristics desired by specific buyers, while also serving as a conduit for children acquired from other sources. The sophistication of the operation was perhaps most evident in its security measures and contingency planning. Network participants used coded communications, maintained separate financial accounts, and employed counter-surveillance techniques to avoid detection. When one component of the network came under investigation, other participants were quickly warned through established communication channels, allowing them to destroy evidence and modify their operations to avoid exposure. The psychological profiles of network participants revealed common characteristics that helped explain how such a widespread conspiracy could develop and maintain itself over such an extended period. Most were individuals who occupied positions of trust and authority within their communities, using their legitimate roles to provide cover for criminal activities. They demonstrated remarkable abilities to compartmentalize their behavior, maintaining respectable public personas while participating in systematic child exploitation. Many participants had gradually descended into criminality through a series of small compromises that eventually led to complete moral corruption. Initial involvement often began with minor ethical violations or financial improprieties that created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by network recruiters. Once compromised, individuals found themselves drawn deeper into the conspiracy through a combination of financial incentives, blackmail, and psychological manipulation. The network also attracted individuals who were drawn to the power and control that child trafficking provided. These participants often exhibited narcissistic personality traits and a sense of superiority that allowed them to view their victims as objects rather than human beings. The systematic dehumanization of children was essential to the network's functioning, allowing participants to engage in horrific acts while maintaining their self-image as respectable members of society. As federal investigators pieced together the full scope of the trafficking network, they began to understand that St. Agnes Orphanage had been merely one component of a criminal enterprise that represented one of the most extensive child exploitation conspiracies in American history. The investigation would ultimately lead to arrests in 12 states and expose a level of systematic child abuse that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. The evidence assembled by federal investigators painted a picture of institutional failure at multiple levels of society. Corrupt officials had enabled the network's operations through willful blindness or active participation. Wealthy elites had created demand for trafficked children through their willingness to pay premium prices for human beings. Professional institutions had provided cover and legitimacy for systematic abuse through their failure to maintain adequate oversight of their members. Most disturbing was the realization that the network had operated successfully for over a decade, while numerous individuals in positions of authority had possessed information that could have exposed the conspiracy. The combination of corruption, intimidation, and institutional self-interest had created an environment where systematic child abuse could flourish while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. The investigation into the broader trafficking network would continue for several more years, ultimately resulting in one of the largest criminal prosecutions in American history. But the evidence already assembled had revealed the true scope of the horror that had been hidden behind the respectable facade of charitable institutions dedicated to child welfare. The 23 children who had vanished from St. Agnes Orphanage were not isolated victims of one woman's cruelty, but casualties of a systematic enterprise that had commodified childhood innocence and traded in human suffering on an industrial scale. The winter of 1887 brought an unexpected visitor to St. Agnes Orphanage, one whose arrival would set in motion events that would expose the true scope of the horror that had consumed those innocent children. Thomas Whitmore, a federal postal inspector investigating financial irregularities in charitable institutions across the Northeast, had been tracking suspicious money transfers connected to religious organizations for nearly 2 years. Whitmore was not a man easily deterred. At 43, he possessed the methodical persistence of someone who had spent his career following paper trails through the labyrinthine bureaucracy of American commerce. His investigation into St. Agnes had begun almost by accident while examining banking records in Philadelphia, where he noticed recurring large cash deposits to accounts associated with various Catholic institutions, including several orphanages that reported unusually high mortality rates among their charges. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Institutions like St. Agnes would receive substantial donations, often in amounts that seemed disproportionate to their reported operations, followed by equally substantial withdrawals that corresponded to payments made to medical schools, private physicians, and wealthy individuals whose names appeared repeatedly across multiple transactions. What made these transfers particularly suspicious was their timing, which often coincided with reports of tragic accidents or disease outbreaks at the institutions in question. Whitmore's initial inquiry to the Albany Diocesan Office about St. Agnes had been met with polite but firm resistance. Bishop Timothy McCloskey, who had replaced the disgraced Bishop Hartley after the earlier scandal, assured Whitmore that all financial matters regarding Catholic institutions were handled internally according to church law, and that no irregularities existed. However, Whitmore's federal authority in matters of postal fraud gave him jurisdiction that transcended religious boundaries. On February 15, 1887, Whitmore arrived unannounced at St. Agnes Orphanage, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and armed with warrants to examine all financial records and correspondence. What he found would shock even a man who had investigated some of the most elaborate fraud schemes of the Gilded Age. The current Mother Superior, Sister Evangeline Crowley, who had assumed leadership after Mother Catherine Murdoch's mysterious disappearance, initially attempted to maintain the facade that had protected the institution for so long. A woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, Sister Evangeline possessed the same commanding presence that had made her predecessor so effective at managing both followers and victims. "Inspector Whitmore," she said with practiced calm as she met him in the orphanage's main parlor, "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. Our financial affairs are managed through the diocesan office, and any irregularities you believe you've detected are surely clerical errors." But Whitmore had not come unprepared. Among the documents in his leather satchel were bank records showing that St. Agnes had processed more than $200,000 in transactions over the past 3 years, an astronomical sum for an institution that claimed to house fewer than 30 children and operate on charitable donations alone. More damning were coded telegrams between Sister Evangeline and various associates, using language that clearly indicated commercial transactions involving human subjects. Sister Evangeline, Whitmore replied, producing a telegram dated just 2 weeks earlier. Could you explain this communication to a Dr. Harrison Matthews in New York? It reads, 3 packages prepared for Wednesday delivery, 2 premium quality, 1 standard. For the first time, Sister Evangeline's composure flickered. The telegram was part of a series that Whitmore had obtained through his postal investigation, communications that revealed the continuing operation of the trafficking network that Mother Catherine had established decades earlier. Under Sister Evangeline's leadership, the network had actually expanded, establishing connections with medical schools as far away as Boston and Baltimore, as well as private collectors who paid premium prices for children with specific characteristics. Whitmore's investigation revealed that the 23 children who had disappeared in 1887 were not the only victims of the St. Agnes operation. Records hidden in a secret compartment behind the chapel altar documented the systematic trafficking of more than 150 children over the past 5 years alone. Some had been sold to medical institutions for experimental purposes, others to wealthy individuals who collected human curiosities, and still others to brothels that specialized in serving clients with particular depravities. The financial records were meticulous in their horror. Each child was cataloged with detailed descriptions of their physical characteristics, estimated market value, and ultimate disposition. Package A47, male, age 8, blonde hair, blue eyes, no visible defects, premium quality, delivered to Boston Medical College for anatomical research. Another entry read, Package A52, female, age 12, red hair, green eyes, musical talent, special commission for private collector in Philadelphia. These were detailed accounts of medical experiments conducted on living children, documenting their responses to various drugs, surgical procedures, and psychological conditioning techniques. Dr. Thornfield, who had supposedly died in the fire that destroyed part of the orphanage, had apparently survived and continued his work under Sister Evangeline's protection. The basement levels of St. Agnes, which had been sealed after the earlier investigation, had been secretly reopened and expanded. Whitmore's team discovered a fully equipped medical laboratory where children were subjected to procedures that defied any legitimate scientific or medical purpose. Operating tables sized for small bodies, restraint devices designed to hold struggling children, and cabinets filled with surgical instruments and experimental drugs painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as research. In one room, investigators found detailed anatomical drawings and photographs documenting the effects of various procedures on child subjects. The clinical precision of these records was perhaps more horrifying than the procedures themselves, revealing minds that had reduced human children to nothing more than experimental materials. One notebook contained entries like, Subject C23 responded well to neural stimulation, vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials, consciousness maintained for 47 minutes after procedure initiation. Sister Evangeline, when confronted with this evidence, finally abandoned her pretense of innocence. Like Mother Catherine before her, she revealed herself to be not a corrupted religious figure, but a calculating criminal who had infiltrated the Catholic system to facilitate her crimes. Born Margaret Henley in Liverpool, she had arrived in America in 1875 with forged credentials and recommendations that had secured her placement within the church hierarchy. Her connection to Mother Catherine Murdoch was revealed through correspondence found in her private quarters. The two women had been partners in the trafficking operation, with Sister Evangeline serving as Mother Catherine's lieutenant and eventual successor. When Mother Catherine had fled after the earlier investigation, she had not disappeared but had relocated to New Orleans, where she established a new operation while maintaining communication and coordination with the continuing activities at St. Agnes. The investigation expanded rapidly as Whitmore followed the network's connections across multiple states. Federal marshals conducted simultaneous raids on associated institutions in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, uncovering a criminal enterprise that had been operating for nearly 4 decades. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving not only corrupted religious institutions, but also medical schools, private physicians, wealthy collectors, and government officials who had been bought or blackmailed into silence. Dr. Harrison Matthews, the New York physician who had been receiving packages from St. Agnes, was arrested at his private clinic on the Upper East Side. His facility, which ostensibly provided medical care to wealthy patients, was revealed to house a collection of human specimens that included both preserved remains and living subjects. Among the victims found in his custody were 3 children from St. Agnes who had been reported as having died from scarlet fever but had actually been sold for medical experimentation. The Matthews Clinic represented the evolution of the trafficking network into something even more sinister than its original form. While the early operations had focused primarily on sexual exploitation and labor trafficking, the network had expanded to serve clients with more exotic and disturbing interests. Wealthy collectors paid enormous sums for children with rare physical characteristics, unusual deformities, or exceptional talents, treating them as living curiosities to be displayed and studied. One client, identified in the records only as the collector, had paid over $5,000 for a series of children with specific genetic traits, apparently attempting to create some form of human breeding program. Another, calling himself the Professor, had purchased more than 20 children over 5 years for what he described as longitudinal studies of human development under controlled conditions. The clinical language used to describe these transactions could not disguise their fundamentally monstrous nature. The medical schools involved in the network presented a different but equally disturbing aspect of the conspiracy. Institutions that trained the next generation of American physicians had been purchasing human subjects for anatomical study and experimental research, often knowing or suspecting that these subjects had been obtained through criminal means. The demand for fresh specimens, particularly those of children, had created a market that the St. Agnes network was perfectly positioned to serve. Professor Edmund Blackwell of the Harvard Medical School, when arrested in connection with the investigation, attempted to justify his actions by claiming that the advancement of medical knowledge required sacrifices that squeamish individuals could not understand. The children we acquired were already doomed, he reportedly told investigators. At least their deaths served a purpose greater than their miserable lives could have achieved. This attitude, reflected in correspondence between various medical professionals involved in the network, revealed a systematic dehumanization of the victims that enabled participants to rationalize their involvement in systematic murder and torture. Children from orphanages were viewed as expendable resources, their lives considered less valuable than the knowledge that could be gained through their exploitation and destruction. The investigation also uncovered the role of government officials who had facilitated the network's operations through deliberate negligence or active participation. Federal judges had dismissed cases that might have exposed the conspiracy. Postal officials had helped conceal communications between network participants, and local law enforcement had been systematically corrupted to prevent investigation of suspicious activities. Senator William Ashford of Pennsylvania, whose name appeared repeatedly in the network's financial records, had received over $50,000 in payments in exchange for using his political influence to block federal investigations into charitable institutions. When confronted with evidence of his involvement, he claimed that he had believed the payments were legitimate political contributions and had no knowledge of the network's criminal activities. However, coded correspondence found in his private papers revealed detailed knowledge of the trafficking operations and specific instructions for preventing government interference. The corruption extended to the highest levels of the Catholic Church hierarchy, with evidence suggesting that Vatican officials had been aware of problems within American institutions, but had chosen to handle matters internally to avoid scandal. Cardinal Francesco Satoli, the first apostolic delegate to the United States, had received detailed reports about irregularities at St. Agnes and similar institutions as early as 1885, but had instructed American bishops to resolve the matters quietly without involving civil authorities. This institutional protection had enabled the network to operate with virtual impunity for decades, secure in the knowledge that religious authority would shield them from secular investigation. The separation of church and state, intended to protect religious freedom, had been perverted into a mechanism for concealing and facilitating systematic crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. As the investigation progressed through the spring and summer of 1887, the true scope of the St. Agnes network became clear. More than 400 children had been trafficked through the system over 40 years, generating profits that exceeded $2 million in contemporary currency. The network had operated facilities in 12 states and had connections to institutions in Canada and Mexico, creating an international trafficking operation that predated similar enterprises by decades. The fate of Mother Catherine Murdoch was finally revealed through documents seized during the raid on the New Orleans operation. She had not simply disappeared, but had continued expanding the network's reach into the Deep South, establishing connections with plantation owners who used trafficked children as laborers, and with medical schools that conducted racial experiments on living subjects. Her operation in Louisiana had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 60 children between 1885 and 1887. Mother Catherine herself had died in early 1887, apparently from natural causes, though some evidence suggested she may have been murdered by associates who feared her knowledge made her a liability. Her body was found in a mansion outside New Orleans, surrounded by documents detailing her criminal empire and personal effects that included jewelry made from the bones of her victims. The 23 children who had disappeared from St. Agnes in 1887 were never found alive. Records indicated that they had been distributed among various clients and institutions, with most meeting their deaths within months of their disappearance. Some had been subjected to medical experiments that killed them quickly. Others had been worked to death in labor operations, and still others had been murdered when they became inconvenient to their captors. 3 of the children were eventually located as preserved specimens in medical collections, their bodies having been used for anatomical study and then retained as teaching materials. The discovery of these remains, bearing clear evidence of ante-mortem torture and experimentation, provided physical proof of the network's activities that complemented the extensive documentary evidence uncovered during the investigation. The trials that followed were among the most sensational of the 19th century, though much of the most disturbing evidence was sealed from public view to protect societal sensibilities. Sister Evangeline Crowley was convicted on 47 counts of murder and sentenced to death, though she died in prison before her execution could be carried out. Dr. Harrison Matthews received a similar sentence and was executed in New York in 1889. Professor Blackwell and several other medical professionals involved in the network received life sentences. The broader conspiracy, however, proved more difficult to prosecute. Many of the wealthy clients who had purchased children from the network were never identified, their transactions having been conducted through intermediaries who had destroyed records or fled the country. Government officials who had facilitated the network's operations claimed ignorance of its criminal nature and largely escaped prosecution through political influence and legal technicalities. The Catholic Church's response to the scandal was swift and comprehensive, though focused more on damage control than justice. St. Agnes Orphanage was closed permanently, its buildings demolished, and the land sold to private developers. Sister Evangeline and other religious figures involved in the network were declared to have been impostors who had infiltrated the church rather than legitimate members of religious orders, allowing the institution to distance itself from their crimes. Pope Leo XIII issued a papal bull in 1888, establishing new procedures for the oversight of charitable institutions and requiring regular inspections by Vatican-appointed officials. However, these reforms were largely symbolic, as the fundamental culture of secrecy and institutional protection that had enabled the network remained unchanged. The investigation, led by Thomas Whitmore, was officially concluded in 1890, though isolated arrests continued for several more years as additional evidence surfaced. Whitmore himself was quietly reassigned to less sensitive duties, with government officials apparently concerned that his thorough investigation had uncovered too much information about high-level corruption and complicity. In his final report, sealed by federal authorities and not released until 1987, Whitmore wrote, "The St. Agnes Network represents not merely a criminal conspiracy, but a fundamental failure of the institutions Americans trust to protect their most vulnerable citizens. The systematic exploitation and murder of hundreds of children was enabled not by a few corrupt individuals, but by entire systems of authority that prioritized institutional preservation over human life." His warning proved prophetic. Throughout the 20th century, similar patterns of institutional abuse and cover-up would emerge repeatedly, suggesting that the lessons of St. Agnes had never truly been learned. The network's methods of psychological manipulation, systematic exploitation, and institutional protection would reappear in various forms, adapted to new circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged in their basic structure and operation. The story of the 23 children who vanished from St. Agnes Orphanage in 1887 thus represents more than a historical tragedy. It serves as a warning about the capacity for evil that exists when unchecked authority combines with systematic dehumanization, and about the vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit sacred trust for profane purposes. Today, the site where St. Agnes Orphanage once stood is occupied by a small park, with no marker indicating the horrors that occurred there. The children who died in that place remain largely forgotten, their names known only to researchers who study the sealed files of one of America's most disturbing criminal conspiracies. Yet their story continues to resonate, reminding us that the price of safety is eternal vigilance against those who would prey upon the vulnerable under the guise of respectability and religious authority. The true horror of St. Agnes lies not just in the crimes that were committed there, but in how easily they were concealed and how readily society accepted explanations that allowed comfortable ignorance to persist. The 23 children who disappeared represent all the victims of institutional evil who suffer in silence, protected only by our willingness to ask difficult questions and demand accountability from those who claim authority over the vulnerable. Their memory challenges us to remain vigilant, to question authority when it demands unthinking obedience, and to remember that the greatest evils often wear the most respectable faces. The abandoned wings of St. Agnes Orphanage stood empty for over 2 decades before anyone discovered what lay hidden beneath the floorboards. When demolition crews finally arrived in 1923, they found something that would haunt investigators for generations: evidence of a trafficking network so sophisticated and brutal that it operated undetected for nearly 40 years, claiming the lives of hundreds of children while generating millions in profit for those who preyed upon society's most vulnerable. What began as a routine investigation into missing orphans would eventually expose one of the most elaborate criminal conspiracies in American history, involving not just the orphanage itself, but a vast network of corrupt officials, medical professionals, and wealthy patrons who had turned child exploitation into a profitable industry. The truth about what happened at St. Agnes between 1883 and 1922 was so disturbing that federal authorities sealed most records for decades, releasing only fragments of testimony that hint at horrors almost too systematic to comprehend. The story begins in 1883 when Mother Catherine Murdoch arrived in the small industrial town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, carrying impeccable credentials from Catholic institutions in Boston and New York. At 42, she possessed the commanding presence and administrative acumen that impressed both church officials and local civic leaders. Her proposal to establish a modern orphanage serving the children of industrial workers killed in mining and factory accidents seemed both timely and necessary. Millbrook in 1883 was experiencing rapid growth fueled by coal mining and steel production. The dangerous nature of this work regularly created orphans, and existing charitable institutions were overwhelmed. Mother Catherine's vision for St. Agnes Orphanage promised to address this crisis while providing these children with education, moral guidance, and preparation for productive adult lives. The initial funding came from an impressive array of sources. Wealthy industrialists, guilty perhaps about the working conditions that created so many orphans, donated generously. The Catholic Church provided both financial support and official sanction. Local government officials, eager to address the growing problem of homeless children, offered tax incentives and municipal cooperation. Construction of St. Agnes began in spring 1884 on a sprawling site outside Millbrook. The main building, an imposing Gothic Revival structure, could house up to 200 children. Additional buildings included workshops where older children would learn trades, a school building, a chapel, an infirmary, and residential quarters for the nuns and staff who would operate the facility. Mother Catherine recruited her staff carefully. Sister Evangeline Crowley, 38, would serve as head administrator, managing the orphanage's daily operations. Sister Margaret Flanagan, 35, would oversee education and moral instruction. Dr. Harold Whitman, a respected physician from Philadelphia, would supervise medical care. Most importantly, Mother Catherine established relationships with placement agencies in major cities that would help find homes for the orphans once they reached appropriate ages. St. Agnes opened its doors in September 1885 with great fanfare. Bishop Thomas McKenna blessed the facility in a ceremony attended by hundreds of local residents and dignitaries. The first group of 37 orphans, ranging in age from 5 to 15, arrived that same week. They were housed in dormitories that, while Spartan, were clean and adequately heated. The children received 3 meals daily, basic education, and religious instruction. For the first 2 years, St. Agnes appeared to fulfill its mission admirably. Local newspapers published glowing reports about the orphanage's work. Visiting church officials praised Mother Catherine's administration. Most importantly, children were being successfully placed with families throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. The placement rate was remarkably high, with nearly 80% of children leaving for new homes within 18 months of arrival. What no one outside the inner circle realized was that these impressive placement statistics concealed a horrifying reality. The vast majority of children listed as successfully placed had never left St. Agnes alive. Instead, they had become victims of a systematic program of exploitation, abuse, and murder that generated enormous profits while maintaining the facade of charitable work. The first hint of something amiss came in 1887 when Thomas Crawford, a railroad worker from Pittsburgh, arrived at St. Agnes seeking to visit his nephew, 8-year-old Michael Crawford, who had been placed there following his parents' death in a factory fire. Mother Catherine informed Crawford that Michael had been adopted by a wonderful family in Ohio just 2 weeks earlier. When Crawford requested the family's contact information so he could maintain a relationship with his nephew, he was told that the adoptive parents had specifically requested no contact with previous family members to help the child adjust to his new life. Crawford's suspicions were aroused by Mother Catherine's evasive responses to his questions about the adoption process. He spent several days in Millbrook making inquiries and discovered that several other relatives of St. Agnes children had received similar explanations about rapid adoptions with no forwarding information. More disturbing, None of the local officials he spoke with could provide any documentation about these placements. Crawford's investigation might have ended there, but he encountered Mary Sullivan, a former kitchen worker at St. Agnes who had been dismissed several months earlier. Sullivan, initially reluctant to speak, eventually revealed information that suggested something sinister was occurring at the orphanage. She described seeing children taken from their dormitories at night and never returned. She spoke of strange visitors who arrived after dark and departed before dawn. Most disturbing, she mentioned overhearing conversations between Mother Catherine and these visitors that involved negotiations over prices and specific physical characteristics. Armed with this information, Crawford contacted Pennsylvania state authorities, specifically the Department of Public Welfare, which had oversight responsibility for orphanages. Inspector James Morrison was assigned to investigate Crawford's allegations. Morrison's preliminary inquiry in early 1888 found St. Agnes to be in apparent compliance with all regulatory requirements. The facility was clean, the children appeared healthy, and the administrative records showed appropriate documentation for all placements. However, Morrison's investigation had been announced in advance, giving Mother Catherine time to prepare. The children he interviewed had clearly been coached in their responses. The records he examined had been carefully curated to show only legitimate activities. Most significantly, the timing of his visit coincided with a period when the most damaging activities had been temporarily suspended. Despite these limitations, Morrison noted several irregularities in his confidential report to superiors. The rate of child placements was unusually high compared to other institutions. The documentation for these placements, while technically adequate, lacked the detail typically maintained by reputable agencies. Most concerning, several children listed as placed had no record of the required medical examinations that should have preceded their departure. Morrison recommended a follow-up investigation with broader scope and no advance notice. This recommendation was filed and apparently forgotten. Morrison himself was reassigned to other duties, and no further official inquiry into St. Agnes occurred for several years. Later investigation would reveal that Mother Catherine had cultivated relationships with key officials in the state bureaucracy, relationships that proved useful in deflecting unwanted attention. Meanwhile, the true operations at St. Agnes continued to expand and evolve. What had begun as a relatively small-scale criminal enterprise grew into something far more systematic and profitable. The key to this expansion was Mother Catherine's realization that the demand for children extended far beyond simple adoption services. Wealthy patrons were willing to pay premium prices for access to children for purposes that had nothing to do with providing loving homes. The network that developed around St. Agnes included several distinct categories of clients. There were legitimate adoptive families who paid standard fees and received healthy children with proper documentation. These legitimate placements, perhaps 20% of the total, provided cover for the criminal activities and helped maintain the orphanage's reputation. The profitable business, however, involved clients with darker purposes. Wealthy men seeking children for sexual exploitation paid enormous sums for access to specific types of victims. Industrial operations looking for cheap labor purchased children who were essentially enslaved in factories, mines, and mills. Most disturbing, medical professionals and researchers paid premium prices for children to be used in experimental procedures that frequently resulted in death. By 1890, St. Agnes had become the center of a sophisticated trafficking network that extended across multiple states. Children arrived through various channels: legitimate orphans from industrial accidents, children purchased from desperate families, and increasingly children who were simply abducted from vulnerable communities. The processing of these children became systematized, with different fates determined based on age, physical appearance, health, and perceived intelligence. Sister Evangeline Crowley emerged as the operational mastermind of this system, while Mother Catherine maintained the public face of the institution and cultivated relationships with officials and donors. Sister Evangeline managed the day-to-day operations of what was essentially a child trafficking business. She maintained detailed records of inventory, client preferences, pricing structures, and delivery schedules. These records, coded to avoid detection, would later provide investigators with comprehensive evidence of the scope of the operation. The medical component of the network was overseen by Dr. Whitman, whose legitimate credentials provided cover for activities that violated every principle of medical ethics. Children selected for medical experimentation were subjected to procedures designed to test new surgical techniques, pharmaceutical compounds, and physiological responses to various stimuli. The mortality rate for these experiments was extremely high, but the detailed documentation provided valuable data that was sold to medical institutions and pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Whitman's experiments were conducted in specially constructed facilities beneath the main orphanage building. These underground chambers, accessible through hidden entrances, contained surgical equipment, laboratory apparatus, and holding cells for subjects awaiting experimentation. The children selected for these procedures were typically told they were receiving special medical treatment to improve their health before placement with adoptive families. The labor trafficking component involved partnerships with industrial operations throughout the region that needed workers willing to accept dangerous conditions for minimal compensation. Children as young as 8 were sold to coal mines, steel mills, and textile factories where they worked in conditions that frequently resulted in injury or death. The purchasers paid substantial fees up front and were not required to provide ongoing reports about the children's welfare. The sexual exploitation network was perhaps the most profitable component of the operation. Wealthy clients, including prominent businessmen, politicians, and even some clergy, paid enormous sums for access to children. Some of these transactions involved permanent purchase, with children disappearing into private residences where their fates remain unknown. Others involved temporary access, with children returned to St. Agnes after periods of abuse before being sold to other clients or disposed of when they were no longer considered valuable. The sophistication of this network extended to its financial operations. Mother Catherine established relationships with banks in multiple cities, using various corporate entities to launder the substantial proceeds from child trafficking. The legitimate charitable donations to St. Agnes provided additional cover, allowing the mixing of legal and illegal funds in ways that made detection difficult. By 1895, the annual revenue from criminal activities exceeded $200,000, equivalent to several $1 million today. This wealth allowed Mother Catherine to expand operations, improve security measures, and cultivate increasingly influential protectors. She made substantial donations to political campaigns, purchased property under various names, and maintained a lifestyle that, while not ostentatious, reflected considerable financial resources. The security measures implemented at St. Agnes became increasingly sophisticated as the operation grew. The facility was surrounded by high walls topped with broken glass. Guard dogs patrolled the grounds at night. The staff included several individuals whose primary function was security rather than childcare. Children were closely monitored at all times, with escape attempts punished severely to discourage others from trying. Perhaps most importantly, Mother Catherine developed an extensive intelligence network that provided advance warning of potential investigations or other threats. She maintained informants in government offices, law enforcement agencies, and competing charitable organizations. This network allowed her to identify and neutralize threats before they could seriously endanger the operation. The psychological control exercised over the children was as systematic as the physical security measures. New arrivals were subjected to a carefully designed process of indoctrination that broke down their resistance and made them compliant with whatever fate awaited them. This process began with isolation from other children, followed by alternating periods of harsh punishment and apparent kindness that created psychological dependency on their captors. Children were told that their families had abandoned them and that the outside world held only danger and rejection. They were convinced that Mother Catherine and the staff at St. Agnes were their only protection against a hostile world. Those who showed signs of resistance were made examples through public punishments that terrorized other children into compliance. The staff recruited to implement these psychological control measures were carefully selected for their willingness to participate in abuse and their ability to maintain secrecy. Many had criminal backgrounds that made them vulnerable to blackmail. Others were motivated by the substantial compensation they received for their complicity. All understood that betrayal of the operation would result in severe consequences. The educational and religious instruction provided to the children served primarily to reinforce their psychological conditioning rather than to provide genuine learning opportunities. They were taught that suffering was God's will, that questioning authority was sinful, and that their role was to accept whatever fate their superiors determined for them. This religious framework provided a veneer of legitimacy for the abuse, while making resistance seem not just futile, but morally wrong. The medical care provided to most children was minimal, designed primarily to maintain their value as commodities, rather than to ensure their health and well-being. However, children selected for certain purposes received excellent medical attention to ensure they met client specifications. This differential treatment created a hierarchy among the children that further discouraged solidarity and resistance. The recreation and social activities at St. Agnes were carefully controlled to prevent the formation of strong bonds between children that might lead to coordinated resistance or mutual support. Children were frequently moved between different dormitories and work assignments to prevent lasting friendships. Those who showed signs of leadership or who attempted to protect other children were quickly identified and either eliminated or transferred to situations where they could not influence others. Despite these extensive control measures, some children did attempt to escape or resist their treatment. These incidents were handled with extreme brutality to serve as examples to other children. Escape attempts resulted in severe beatings, extended periods of solitary confinement, and sometimes death. The bodies of children who died as a result of punishment or failed escape attempts were disposed of in ways that left no evidence of their fate. The disposal of bodies became an increasingly significant operational challenge as the volume of deaths increased. Initially, bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the orphanage grounds. As this became impractical due to the numbers involved, Mother Catherine developed relationships with medical schools and research institutions that would accept bodies for anatomical study with minimal questions about their origin. Some bodies were cremated in furnaces constructed in the orphanage's basement, with the ashes scattered in remote locations. Others were dissolved using chemical processes that left minimal physical evidence. The most valuable remains, typically those of children who had been subjects in medical experiments, were preserved and sold to collectors or researchers willing to pay premium prices for specimens with documented experimental histories. The documentation of these disposal methods was maintained in Sister Evangeline's coded records, which tracked not only the fate of individual children, but also the financial returns generated by different disposal options. This macabre accounting system treated human remains as inventory to be managed for optimal profit, reflecting the complete dehumanization that characterized the entire operation. By 1900, St. Agnes had processed over 3,000 children through its various programs. Of these, fewer than 400 had been legitimately placed with adoptive families. The remainder had been sold into slavery, sexual exploitation, or medical experimentation, or had died as a result of abuse, neglect, or punishment. The scale of this atrocity was unprecedented in American history, yet it continued to operate undetected due to the carefully constructed facade of charitable work and the extensive network of corruption that protected it. The beginning of the end for the St. Agnes operation came not from law enforcement investigation, but from an internal power struggle that began around 1918. Mother Catherine, now in her 70s, began to show signs of declining mental faculties. Sister Evangeline, who had managed the operational details for decades, began to position herself to take control of the entire enterprise. The conflict between these two women intensified over questions of succession and the direction of future operations. Mother Catherine favored a more conservative approach that would reduce risks by scaling back the most dangerous activities. Sister Evangeline advocated for expansion, believing that the network they had built was sufficiently protected to allow for increased volume and profitability. This internal conflict led to operational mistakes that had been avoided during the years of unified leadership. Security measures were relaxed as each woman attempted to position her own supporters in key positions. Financial records became less carefully maintained as both sides attempted to secure resources for their anticipated power struggle. Most significantly, the careful vetting of clients and disposal of evidence became less systematic as attention focused on internal politics rather than operational security. The mistakes created opportunities for outside observers to glimpse the true nature of the St. Agnes operation. Former staff members who had been dismissed during the power struggle began to speak more openly about what they had witnessed. Financial irregularities that had previously been carefully concealed became visible to bank officials and government auditors. The investigation into St. Agnes Orphanage had reached a turning point by the winter of 1962. Federal agents had spent months piecing together financial records, tracking down survivors, and following leads that stretched across multiple states. What they discovered was an operation so vast and systematic that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend its full scope. Agent Patricia Henley, no relation to the insurance investigator Thomas Henley from a century earlier, had been assigned to coordinate the multi-agency task force examining the St. Agnes network. Her temporary office in downtown Philadelphia was filled with evidence boxes, witness statements, and maps dotted with pins marking locations connected to the conspiracy. The walls were covered with photographs of missing children, organizational charts showing connections between various institutions, and timelines that stretched back nearly 4 decades. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Walsh, a pediatric psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, had been treating a young woman named Sarah Collins, who had been rescued from a private residence in Baltimore during an unrelated police raid. Sarah, now 23, had spent the first 16 years of her life within the St. Agnes system, moved between various facilities and private homes in what the organization called placement rotations. During therapy sessions, Sarah had begun to recover memories that had been suppressed through a combination of psychological conditioning and pharmaceutical intervention. Her accounts provided investigators with the first detailed inside perspective on how the St. Agnes network operated from the victim's point of view. What she revealed was a system of abuse that was both more sophisticated and more horrific than anything the federal investigation had yet uncovered. They called it the program, Sarah told Dr. Walsh during a session that was recorded with her permission and later provided to federal investigators. Every child in the system was evaluated and categorized based on their appearance, temperament, and what they called special qualities. The enhanced preparation, according to Sarah's testimony, involved systematic psychological conditioning designed to create absolute obedience and dependency. Children selected for this track were isolated from their peers, subjected to alternating periods of harsh discipline and artificial affection, and gradually introduced to increasingly inappropriate situations under the guise of special training or religious instruction. Mother Catherine would tell us we were chosen, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She said God had selected us for a higher purpose, that we would serve important people who would help spread the church's mission. The conditioning was reinforced through what the organization called correction sessions, punishment periods that could last days or weeks, depending on the perceived severity of a child's transgression. Sarah described being confined in small, windowless rooms, deprived of food and water, and subjected to combinations of sensory deprivation and overwhelming stimulation designed to break down psychological resistance. More disturbing were her accounts of the medical procedures performed on children within the system. Dr. Harrison Muller, the physician who had provided medical cover for the organization's activities, had conducted regular examinations that went far beyond standard health care. According to Sarah, these examinations involved procedures that seemed designed to determine a child's suitability for different types of placement, rather than to monitor their health. Dr. Mueller would examine us in ways that felt wrong, Sarah testified. He would take photographs, make detailed notes about our physical development, and sometimes give us injections that would make us sleepy and confused. Agent Henley's investigation had already identified Dr. Mueller as a central figure in the conspiracy, but Sarah's testimony provided crucial details about his methods and the scope of his involvement. The physician had apparently maintained detailed medical files on every child in the system, documenting not only their physical health, but their psychological profiles, behavioral responses to various forms of conditioning, and their reactions to pharmaceutical interventions. When federal agents finally obtained a warrant to search Dr. Mueller's private practice in suburban Philadelphia, they discovered a hidden office containing files on more than 800 children who had passed through the St. Agnes system over the years. The files were organized by categories that made their purpose horrifyingly clear: domestic placement, international placement, medical research subjects, and a category simply labeled as terminated. The domestic placement files contained detailed information about wealthy families across the United States who had paid substantial sums to acquire children from the St. Agnes network. These were not legitimate adoptions, but rather transactions involving children who were essentially sold into various forms of servitude or abuse. The families involved included prominent businessmen, political figures, and even some clergy members who had used their positions of authority to facilitate or cover up their participation in the network. International placement files revealed an even more disturbing dimension to the conspiracy. The St. Agnes organization had established connections with similar networks in Europe, South America, and Asia, facilitating the trafficking of American children to overseas locations where they would be even more isolated from potential rescue or investigation. Financial records indicated that international placements commanded significantly higher prices than domestic ones, with some transactions involving payments of more than $50,000 per child. The medical research subject files documented the systematic use of children from the St. Agnes system in unauthorized medical experiments. Dr. Mueller had been providing subjects to pharmaceutical companies, university research programs, and private medical facilities that were conducting studies on the effects of various drugs, psychological conditioning techniques, and medical procedures. The children used in these experiments were typically those deemed unsuitable for placement due to physical or behavioral issues, making them essentially disposable in the organization's twisted calculus. Most chilling were the terminated files, which contained records of children who had died while in the custody of the St. Agnes network. The causes of death ranged from complications during medical procedures to what were euphemistically described as training accidents. In each case, the deaths had been covered up through falsified medical records, bribery of local officials, or the simple expedient of claiming the children had been transferred to other facilities or had run away. Sarah Collins had been fortunate to survive the system, though her testimony made clear that survival had come at a tremendous psychological cost. She had been placed with a wealthy family in Baltimore when she was 16, ostensibly as a domestic servant, but actually as what the organization termed a companion for the family's adult son, who suffered from what would now be recognized as severe mental illness and violent tendencies. They told me it was a privilege to serve such an important family, Sarah recalled. Mrs. Henderson explained that their son required special care and understanding, and that I had been specifically chosen because of my training and temperament. C. She had managed to slip away from her handlers and had sought help at a police station, though her initial attempts to report her situation had been dismissed by officers who assumed she was either a runaway or mentally unstable. It was only when Sarah was arrested during the Baltimore raid, which had been targeting the Henderson family's involvement in an unrelated financial crime, that her connection to the St. Agnes network was discovered. The Henderson family had attempted to claim that Sarah was simply a troubled employee, but medical examination had revealed evidence of long-term physical and sexual abuse that corroborated her accounts of her treatment. The Henderson case became a crucial component of the federal investigation because it provided concrete evidence of how the St. Agnes network operated at the end-user level. Financial records seized from the Henderson family showed regular payments to various shell organizations connected to St. Agnes, with clear documentation of the services being purchased. The payments were structured as donations to charitable organizations, providing tax benefits while facilitating the acquisition of victims. More significantly, the Henderson family's records contained correspondence with other wealthy families who had participated in similar arrangements. This correspondence revealed a network of customers that extended across the eastern United States, with some connections reaching as far as California and Texas. The letters discussed the quality of various children provided by the St. Agnes network, comparing their suitability for different purposes and sharing recommendations about handling and training techniques. Agent Henley found these customer communications to be among the most disturbing evidence she had encountered in her 20-year career with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The letters discussed children as though they were commodities, with detailed evaluations of their physical appearance, behavioral characteristics, and responses to various forms of control. Some correspondents shared techniques for maintaining discipline, while others described their preferences for certain types of children based on age, appearance, or psychological profile. One letter, dated just 6 months before the Henderson raid, exemplified the casual cruelty of the network's customers. The young lady you provided last spring has proven most satisfactory for our purposes. Her training appears quite thorough, as she has required minimal correction to adapt to our household routines. We would be interested in acquiring a similar companion for our summer residence, preferably with the same attention to discretion and obedience. These customer communications also revealed the sophisticated methods the St. Agnes network used to maintain security and avoid detection. Children were moved frequently between different facilities and private homes to prevent them from forming attachments or learning too much about the organization's structure. They were given false identities and backgrounds that would explain their presence in various households, and they were subjected to ongoing psychological conditioning designed to prevent them from seeking help or revealing information about their situation. The network also employed a system of handlers who served as intermediaries between the central organization and its customers. These handlers were responsible for delivering children to their placements, monitoring their adjustment, and dealing with any problems that arose. They also served as a buffer between the leadership of the St. Agnes network and the end users, providing plausible deniability if any aspect of the operation was exposed. Agent Henley's investigation identified at least 12 individuals who had served as handlers for the network over the years. Most were former clergy members or social workers who had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives and compromising situations that left them vulnerable to blackmail. The handlers were well compensated for their services, but they were also closely monitored to ensure their continued loyalty and silence. The most senior handler identified by the investigation was Father Michael Donovan, a defrocked Catholic priest who had been expelled from his order in 1945 following allegations of inappropriate conduct with altar boys. Rather than facing prosecution, Father Donovan had been quietly transferred to work with the St. Agnes network, where his clerical background provided useful cover for his activities, transporting children and interfacing with customers who preferred to believe they were participating in legitimate charitable work. Father Donovan had maintained detailed records of his activities, apparently as insurance against potential betrayal by his superiors in the organization. When federal agents searched his residence in Atlantic City, they discovered a comprehensive archive documenting 15 years of operations, including customer lists, financial transactions, and detailed reports on the disposition of individual children. These records provided investigators with their clearest picture yet of the scope and profitability of the St. Agnes network. Between 1947 and 1962, the organization had processed more than 1,200 children, generating revenues that exceeded $2 million. The operation had grown steadily over the years, with the number of children processed annually increasing from fewer than 30 in the early years to more than 100 by 1960. The financial records also revealed the network's sophisticated money laundering operations, which were necessary to disguise the source and destination of the substantial sums involved in child trafficking. Payments from customers were processed through a complex web of charitable organizations, religious institutions, and private businesses that made it extremely difficult for investigators to trace the money back to its criminal origins. The St. Agnes network had also invested heavily in maintaining its cover operations, including legitimate orphanages, schools, and healthcare facilities that provided services to children while also serving as recruitment and processing centers for the trafficking operation. These legitimate activities generated positive publicity and community support that helped shield the organization from scrutiny while also providing tax benefits and access to government funding. As the investigation progressed through the spring of 1963, Agent Henley began to understand that the St. Agnes network represented a new type of criminal organization, one that combined the systematic methods of organized crime with the institutional cover and social respectability of charitable and religious organizations. The network had evolved sophisticated techniques for identifying, acquiring, and exploiting vulnerable children while maintaining the appearance of legitimate child welfare work. The organization's leadership had also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, continuously refining their methods based on experience and changing circumstances. When adoption laws became more stringent in the 1950s, making it harder to place children through official channels, the network had shifted toward private placements that bypassed official oversight. When public attention to child welfare issues increased, the organization had enhanced its public relations efforts and expanded its legitimate charitable activities to maintain community support. Most concerning to investigators was evidence that the St. Euthymus network had begun to franchise its operations, providing training, resources, and ongoing support to similar organizations in other parts of the country. Financial records indicated regular payments to affiliated groups in California, Texas, and Florida, suggesting that the trafficking of children had become a nationwide enterprise, with St. Agnes serving as the flagship operation. The revelation that the conspiracy extended far beyond the original investigation's scope prompted federal authorities to expand their inquiry into a national task force involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The new investigation, codenamed Operation Guardian, would eventually identify connections between the St. Agnes network and child trafficking operations in more than 20 states, making it one of the largest criminal investigations in American history to that point. But even as the investigation expanded, Agent Henley remained focused on the human cost of the conspiracy. Each file, each financial transaction, each piece of correspondence represented a child whose life had been destroyed by the greed and cruelty of the adults who were supposed to protect them. The investigation had already identified hundreds of victims, but Henley knew that many more remained missing, their fates unknown and their suffering unacknowledged. The weight of this knowledge, combined with the daily exposure to evidence of systematic child abuse, took a significant toll on the investigators working the case. Several agents requested transfers to other assignments, unable to continue confronting the reality of what human beings were capable of doing to children. Those who remained, including Agent Henley, were sustained by the hope that their work would lead to justice for the victims and prevent similar atrocities in the future. As winter approached in 1963, the investigation was preparing to enter its most crucial phase, the identification and prosecution of the network's leadership and major customers. The evidence gathered over the previous year had provided a clear picture of the organization's structure and operations, but translating that evidence into successful prosecutions would require careful coordination between federal and state authorities, as well as the cooperation of victims who had survived the system. The challenges were enormous, but Agent Henley and her colleagues were determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion. The children who had suffered and died within the St. Agnes network deserved nothing less than the full weight of American justice, and the investigators were committed to ensuring that those responsible would finally be held accountable for their crimes. The evidence they had gathered painted a picture of systematic evil that had operated for decades under the cover of charitable work and religious mission, but it also revealed the courage and resilience of survivors like Sarah Collins, whose willingness to speak the truth had made the investigation possible. The vanishing of 23 children from St. Agnes Orphanage remains one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, a case that exposes the darkest capabilities of those entrusted with protecting the innocent. What we've uncovered through these long sealed documents reveals not just the systematic disappearance of vulnerable children, but a web of corruption and cover up that reaches into the highest levels of both religious and civil authority. The truth about what happened in those Wisconsin halls between 1854 and 1862 serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most respectable faces, and that our vigilance in protecting the vulnerable must never waver. These children's voices, silenced for over 160 years, deserve to be heard and remembered, and remembered, and remembered, and remembered, and remembered, and remembered.